Thank you, Andrew and Denise, for being here today to talk about their work and to talk about imagining CDR futures and possibilities through speculative fiction. Andrew Dana Hudson is a speculative fiction author and sustainability researcher. His recent book, Our Shared Storm, a novel of 5 climate futures, uses provocative stories to illustrate the IPCC's shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios. He has published over 20 pieces of short fiction, including winning the 2016 Everything Changed Climate Fiction Contest. You can follow his work via his newsletter, solarshades.club. Denise Baden is a professor of sustainability at the University of Southampton. In her work, she is particularly keen in exploring innovative ways to maximize engagement and impact from research. To this end, in 2018, Denise set up the series of free green stories writing competitions to inspire writers to integrate green solutions into their writing. This has run 15 competitions so far, resulting in several publications. Denise herself has published numerous book chapters and articles in the academic realm, an eco-themed rom-com, Habitat Man, and novella, The Assassin, and has written 3 other screenplays. Denise compiled the anthology No More Fairy Tales, Stories to Save the Planet in association with Herculean Climate Solutions. The aim is to inspire COP27 delegates with climate solutions. She's written 3 stories for this anthology and co-written 2 others. And I'll just say my name is Reena Shah. I am a writer, editor, and teacher. I'm currently a Steinbeck Fellow at San Jose State University, as well as a Michener Fellow here at the University of Texas of Austin. And I'm at work on a novel. And so that's a little bit about me. So I want to just jump in before we get to the subject of storytelling about carbon removal specifically and climate. I wanted to hear more about your own stories as writers, scholars, and activists. What led you to writing about climate change and, to these subjects?
Well, for me, it's because I work in sustainability in the academic realm. I worry about how few people actually read academic articles. And, I've developed a fair sense of what we need to be doing to address the climate crisis, but how many people are going to read those articles? It's only people who are already interested, for a start. So, and I just became very interested in fiction as a way to reach a much wider audience. Actually, it's fiction itself that turned me into a greenie. It's also a way, I think, to engage people who might never watch a climate change documentary. And having engaged in that personally, I also find it quite therapeutic. I don't know if Andrew finds the same, but when you're so frustrated, in meetings, trying to push ahead, climate mitigation aspects, and someone saying, 2023, we're scheduled to reduce our type 2 emissions by switching to renewable energy. And you're thinking, why not this afternoon? In fiction, you can write what you want. You can write it. You can write what you think can happen. And it's hard working in the field as an academic. It's like you're facing the sun. You don't want to look too closely at what it is you're researching, because it's quite frightening. So writing climate solutions for me is therapy as well as a way of getting the word out there. What about you, Andrew?
Yeah, I think I've been sort of a lifelong science fiction reader and fan, and became the kind of person for whom that was a key tool that I used to make sense of the world, right? Thinking about the future, right? Some people think about history or what have you. But you can use thinking and writing about the future to try and anchor yourself in our crazy world. So that was kind of always there. And I'd always been interested in writing fiction. And at one point, over time, it dawned on me. It didn't really dawn on me, but it became sort of an increasing sense that, well, the thing that was going to define my future as a person on this planet and that of my children, if I have them and so forth, is not going to be going to space like a lot of the books I read as a kid is going to be about what's happening here on the planet, to our atmosphere, to our environment. So I got interested in the work being done around that, which was smaller than you'd think at the time, which I started latching onto it and started writing some climate fiction, co-wrote a story for ASU's first climate fiction contest, and we won the contest. And it was one of those sort of moments that's like, wow, maybe this is a thing that I can do. And so I just kind of kept at it and went to grad school, studied sustainability, and all the while worked writing fiction into my sort of scholarly pursuits. And now sort of here I am feeling like fiction is kind of the main thing that I produce and offer to the world, and the lens through which I try and get ideas out there most of the time.
I mean, I think thank you for that. I think both of you, just the idea of imagining the future and how fiction can do that in a way that, I think something, Denise, you said that you can write what you think can happen, is such a beautiful way of thinking of it. And both of you have work that has recently been released or is about to be released. And I was wondering if you could just quickly, Andrew, if you could talk about your novel as well as the new short story that you're going to read from today. Denise, if you could just summarize your short story collection, what your goals were in that.
I'll start. My novel, Our Shared Storm, a novel of 5 climate futures, is published this year by Fordham University Press, and it came out of my grad school thesis, basically, where I wanted to use stories to engage with and illustrate the SSPs, which are I think probably most of our listeners know, the set of climate scenarios that are now being used in sort of the AR6 report by the IPCC and so forth. One, to communicate them to a broader audience, and two, to sort of engage with them using this kind of unique tool. And the book is also set at the COP. It's set at 5 different versions of the COP, one for each scenario, and sort of tries to imagine less what the future of the climate impacts are going to be, but more what the future of our climate politics is going to be, in terms of who has a say, and just what kind of event is the COP. So in one story, it's pretty familiar to what it is today. In another story, it's more of this like big, booming, hyped up trade fair. In another, it's kind of devolved to more of a Davos-esque meeting of elites. In another, it's sort of just the scientists are meeting because the UN has collapsed, and we're sort of charting the slide into the greenhouse, into the hothouse. And then there's one in which it's become this kind of broader meeting for global sort of planetary planning. And, within all these different scenarios, I have core characters, and they are sort of remixed so that they become different people living different lives, depending on the choices that we have made for the world over the next couple decades. So that's what the pitch for that. It also comes with kind of an extended discussion of what climate fiction is and all that sort of thing as an afterword. And one of the subjects I touch on in one of the stories is carbon removal, and so I've been on this kind of trying to explore what that civilizational project that I like to call climate repair might look like. And so I recently wrote a story that we published on the Open Air Collective website that is a really kind of on the ground, like burner phone version of what a complicated, messy, but sort of getting there future regime of building out the carbon removal industry might look like in Reno, Nevada, specifically, and following one of young entrepreneurs hustle, trying to find his way into the field and figure out what this is all about and how he can make a buck doing it. So yeah, it's live right now, so people should go read it. It's called the Collector, with a 2 in there, CO2 lector.
Yeah, I'm excited because you're going to read a little bit from that in a little bit. Yeah, Denise, if you could talk a little bit about your short story collection and some of your writing.
Okay, so the first sort of work of fiction I did arose out of the Green Stories competition. So I set them up, and like you said, we've run about 15 now, and there was a clear brief not to talk about the problems, but to talk about the solutions, because my view is raising awareness is pointless now. If people aren't aware there's a problem, it's because they're choosing not to be. So I was very keen to have a solution focus, but no one was writing solutions. Everyone just kept writing catastrophic climate fiction. And I thought there's already plenty of that. I wanted to fill in the gap of showing what a sustainable society might look like. And so my first book, I guess, was an attempt to say, do something like this. So it was, I got Habitat Man, which is about a guy who gives up his job to come and help people make their gardens wildlife friendly. And I skip all the statistics on extinction and biodiversity loss and habitat loss. I go straight to the solutions. So, for example, so many novels I got were about people chopping down, going to confront evil rainforest loggers. And it's like, actually, if you want that to stop, your reader is not going to give up their job and go out to Brazil to confront rainforest loggers. But what you could do is look at where your wood's coming from. Look at, are you buying beef? What are you doing? So in my book, he digs up a body, and then that's an opportunity to talk about natural burials, not using, mahogany wood. So, that was my first one. As part of the anthology, I've written 3. One of them is a little mini novella called The Assassin, which is 8 people set in a citizen's jury debating climate solutions, and one of them is an assassin. So it's a nice opportunity to talk about those. And someone suggested to me it'd make a good play, so I'm working on that next. But with the anthology, I don't have that to show you yet because it's just being published, as we speak. But it was a real editing. It was such a challenge because, all the climate experts might agree on what they want, but how to get there? No. So, the engineers like the great big, bold, audacious solutions that, cost a lot of money and energy to make, but have potential to draw down, millions of tons. The nature lovers and ecologists are like, what's that going to do to habitats and biodiversity? And the social scientists are saying, well, what's the point doing any of this if we carry on consuming at the rate we're doing anyway? So I'm hoping we manage to get a real mix of the perspectives there. So one of the ones I had a big hand in was Climate Gamers, which Chance Glasgow narrated, the Call of Duty guy. And it imagines a big competition. So I don't think any gamers out there who play Civilization, but it's a kind of scenario building, you need to conquer the world. And it kind of Civilization meets the En-ROADS scenarios where you can move levers around to try and get below 1.5. And it imagines there's this big competition and everyone's trying to work out how to get down to 1.5 as part of a game. And that's a lovely opportunity to have different teams taking different approaches. There's your techies, there's your nature lovers, there's your ones looking at more systemic, aspects like carbon allowances and, switching to a happy planet index instead of the GDP and green finance and all that stuff. So, and then there's all the technical carbon drawdown solutions and so on. So that's quite a nice one to introduce all the solutions. And then throughout, I think we've got a real mix of the technical carbon dioxide removal ones. Like there's one about artificial trees, sucking, carbon dioxide out the air. There's plenty of the nature ones, like planting seagrass and kelp and mangroves. We didn't really worry about afforestation because the potential of the ocean is so much greater, actually, than the potential of land. And there's quite a few like mine, which was like The Assassin, which is set in a citizen's jury, which is, again, a solution because it changes the way decisions are made beyond the electoral cycle, long-term thinking. So I'm really excited to see what people make of that. And a key part of it, again, was the solution-based. So today, I'm just sort of trying to finish off. We've been compiling web pages to go with every story and every solution. So if someone thinks, oh, I've just read a great story about mangrove terraces and biochar, how can, I'd like to know more, they can click on the QR code and they can go straight to that and work and see what's happening and what they can do and so on.
It's interesting. Both of you talked about like scenarios, and I know, Andrew, you talk about, I think I read this somewhere, scenario thinking, and that some of that reminds me of gaming, like the gaming culture. And, I come from like a I'm a fiction writer, very different kind of fiction, but there are like speculative elements entering my work. And I'm seeing that with a lot of writers. I'm meeting more and more writers who are also involved in gaming and these scenarios and how that can play out in fiction. And so I know I wanted to talk about like what is just defining terms, like how do you see climate fiction and speculative fiction, and there's overlap there, but also it sounds specifically this idea of focusing on solutions or focusing on what are the scenarios that are going to define our futures. It does seem like it's about these it's almost these imagining these situations and trying to imagine ourselves into a future that isn't just about defining the catastrophes, right? And so how do you see that as maybe a shift in what climate fiction, or possible shift within climate fiction?
Yeah, I mean, my just sort of anecdotal read of the room is that I think a lot of the sort of sci-fi writers have moved on to writing more about these kind of solutions regimes or kind of what different transitions and climate approaches might look like, and then sort of the literary writers are starting to do some of the more catastrophic dystopian scenarios that are a little bit out of favor, or going out of favor, drifting out of favor in the sci-fi community. So but I think there's room for all of those. One of the things that I really ended up wanting to do and feeling good about doing in my novel is trying to hold these two possibilities together at the same time, and not say just that this is a catastrophe, though it could be, and also not saying, well, this is going to just go great, because it might not. And I think there's something really powerful about being able to hold that dystopian possibility and that sort of utopian opportunity in your mind at once, and start to make choices about it. And then what's nice about the SSPs as a way to guide one particular set of scenarios and thinking this way is that they all there's more than just a sort of linear spectrum to place yourself on. There's a whole sort of space, a whole grid that offers different sort of suggestions of how our society might evolve. And I think that that for me is what's really interesting, because we have normative choices to make beyond just, do we pursue climate action or do we not, right? There are different ways that different regimes of climate action can have different winners and losers and benefit different classes and parties. And I think that's something that we should talk about. Just to go to your question of definitions, speculative fiction for me, I use it because I feel like it's a sort of a bucket term that includes science fiction and fantasy, and also horror, and that sort of anything that kind of is not trying to just depict the real world. And there are, if you want genre drama, there are some people that use speculative fiction as a way to distance themselves from science fiction and the tropes there, which I'm not interested in doing. But what I do think is going on is that it helps us dig into what science fiction is really is doing, which is it is speculating about social change at being driven by science and technology development, right? Science fiction is fiction that is interested in science and that is about science. And so climate fiction offers us an opportunity to sort of set down that theory of social change and pick up another one and say, wait a second, I'm not convinced that the next iPhone or gadget or social network is going to actually be the thing that controls, that determines my future. I think the thing that's going to most shape life in the 21st century is going to be climate change. And so we take up climate fiction as a way to explore that theory of social change and give it its own place in the discussion. So that's kind of my pitch for how those are distinguished. But I'd be really curious to know what Denise feels and how she defines it.
Well, actually, you really made me think there, because science fiction is one of these terms that just rolls off your tongue, and I forgot that it meant anything to do with science. I just sort of, but obviously it does, and it made me think that I would define some of the stories that I've written for the anthology as social science fiction, because I kind of stepped outside politics to look at more of the systemic aspects. Because when you look at systems theory, people always think, oh, changing political party will help. But everyone's plugged into the same systems, constraints, and carrots and sticks. So actually, it makes less difference than you might think. But things like switching from the gross domestic product to a well-being index as the key metric of success that everyone talks about, that would be a game changer. Changing currency to be based on carbon emissions, carbon footprint of products, that would be a game changer. That would change everything. It would change what we buy, what we sell, what we invest in. These are game-changing differences. So switching from an economy where we buy, use, throw away to maybe libraries of things or fashion toys libraries, again, these are game-changing concepts. So, but they're not anything a political party can say, hey, let's have personal carbon allowances, because everyone's saying, huh, what's that? You can't explain it in a soundbite. There were, like you said, there'll be winners, there'll be losers, there'll be people gaming the system, there'll be benefits. A book, a story can play all those out in a safe space. And it can create a bottom-up awareness or vision actually of how things might work. And I find that incredibly exciting. So thank you for that. You've given me the term social science fiction, and I'm going to use that now.
No, I think you should. I mean, that's part of what inspired this particular framing for me is at some point hearing Ursula Le Guin's work described as anthropological fiction. And I think that's really right. I mean, Le Guin is, in my opinion, the greatest of all time speculative fiction authors, but a lot of her work is not about inventing new technologies. It's about different ways of arranging society. And, I think we have right now in speculative fiction, a generation of people who have come up feeling like the key blockage to exciting social change is not, in fact, we need to invent the next thing. It's these political questions. I often go back to what's called the alligator graph, which sort of charts productivity versus wages in the United States, and they sort of go up together, and then they diverge, where wages stagnate starting in the 70s, but productivity keeps going, and it looks like an alligator opening its mouth. And I think if you go back and you show this to sort of golden age sci-fi writers from the 40s and 50s, they would be really startled. Yeah. They would find this really shocking that we could keep developing technologically, but not keep sharing but not keep sort of developing as a sort of broader prosperity. And I think that that is a question that science fiction needs to reckon with, and we have a lot of people now who are less interested in sort of basing their stories off some new scientific paper or new technology, and more interested on playing with political and social arrangements.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Denise.
No, you.
Well, I was just going to say, to what both of you are talking about and this kind of power of storytelling to do that, I think there's also this effort to make personal what is political or what is scientific, and how, or what is, thinking about the climate as not this abstract, separate layer of our lives, but very much integrated into how we live. And I love that you mentioned Ursula Le Guin, because I think that was one of the things that I loved about her, is that she talked about also the domestic realm within these worlds that she created, and very much about how people live. I want to talk about how carbon removal figures into all of this. And often it's when it's thought of as kind of like a sci-fi solution, it's called, well, how does that happen? That's science fiction. But from like a creative perspective, why do you think it's so compelling as a subject? Both of you, I know, Denise, you talked about that one of your stories, I think it's one of your stories in the collection, specifically focuses on carbon removal. And I know, Andrew, the story that you're reading from, carbon removal is one of the like driving factors for this character. I love the character that you created in the story. So yeah, if you could talk, both of you could talk about that. I don't know if Denise, you want to start.
Sure, yeah. So it was quite interesting. I put each solution in front of a load of climate experts, and carbon dioxide removal and direct air capture, a lot of people didn't like it. They were like, well, there's just no point. Because the moment we give ourselves an out by saying, we can just pluck it out the sky, especially with the GDP as a key metric, costs a lot of money. That boosts the GDP even while it depletes our budget. They didn't like it at all. And then there's the others saying, well, we absolutely have to do that. That just because we want to take it out doesn't mean we're okay with continuing to emit. Don't think we're saying it has to be one or the other. And I came across a new term, green hush. So we've all heard of greenwash. Have you heard of green hush? I'm presuming it's sort of the sort of dismissing of technological solutions out of hand from a reaction against thinking technology will save us. And there's real divisions. I think that's what was so interesting in editing and managing all the different authors and experts. But yeah, to the stories, we've got a mix of the technical ones, a mix of the nature ones, and a mix of let's just not put any more in there. But I think Andrew can talk to the technical side, because that's very, his story, Our Shared Storm, very much focuses on that.
Yeah. So for me, I mean, I got into thinking deeply about carbon removal stuff, and actually there's some of it way back in the first climate fiction that I started writing, a story called Sunshine State, co-written with Adam Flynn. But when I was studying at ASU, I took a class with Klaus Lochner, who's sort of called the father of direct air capture, about this whole realm of approaching. And that just opened up a lot of things for me. And, I'm of the opinion, okay, we need to decarbonize as quickly and radically as possible. But even if we manage to do that fast enough to keep the world at 1.5 warming, that's a much nastier world than I grew up in, right? It's just sort of a fundamentally more hostile climate, even if we do a lot of adaptation. Just the heavy weather is going to hit us year after year after year. It doesn't go away because we're talking about stabilizing the planet, not repairing the damage that we've done to the climate over the last 100 and so years. So I think that if we just sort of look at this long term, not in sort of a long-termist kind of way, but just, apply a science fictional lens, or we think about what this problem will be like to people a couple decades, a couple generations down the line, I feel like they're going to want to go try and clean up the mess, basically, and won't want to live in a world where we have these really devastating hurricanes and heat waves and winter storms and droughts every year. It is really energy intensive. It's a big project, but I think it's worth thinking about whether or not and how we can approach this, not as a techno fix to our current problems of reducing emissions, but as sort of like a harder thing that we then have to take up, right? We'll decarbonize, but that's not the end of it. That's just sort of one step to finding our way to a habitable planet and getting some control on these forces that really have the power to devastate human lives. So, I find it interesting just to feel like, well, this is a thing that might happen. What does it look like? Any any upheaval to the sort of industrial material base of society is going to have these sort of social ramifications. And that's my realm. I get to go and play in and think about how they might entwine with other forms of social change and economic shifts and might shape people's lives. So I'm interested in it, both in a kind of figuring out how we can do this sort of way, and also in a just, when we do this, how will that play out for people, for characters who can be sort of the protagonists of stories.
I love the whole point about thinking about how a scenario plays out. And I think in some ways, we're in this age of intense storytelling, right? Everything we see and read, everything on social media is ultimately about storytelling, but often it's reductive storytelling because it's these quick, I think Denise, you mentioned sound bites or stories from just one narrow perspective, right? We've all read about how we're becoming more and more fixed in our echo chamber digital universes. And, I think great fiction has always been about expanding our senses of the possible and expanding our perspective, like widening that lens, even as that adage in fiction that the more specific you get, the more universal you get. And so, but in a lot of the discourse that you see online or in debates, it's the opposite of that that's happening. You're getting so generalized that you can't see the full scenario, in a way. And so I think one of the things I'm thinking about is how, Denise, you talked about the idea of fiction reaching more people than, say, an academic paper, but also maybe reaching people in a different way. And I think, Andrew, what you talked about in terms of like thinking about carbon removal within a context, right? And how that will change all sorts of different things in a specific place. Like you set the story in Reno, and it's very specific to Reno, which I really love. It's specific to that setting, so that these solutions aren't in a vacuum. Right. That's what I think fiction can do, is it can drop you in a place and let you look around in a way that an article can't do in the same way, or just some of the more sort of polemic, like, well, this is right. No, this is right. Well, maybe we need to move away from right and just look at what are the possibilities, right? I'm thinking, I wanted to just very quickly before Andrew, you give us a reading. How do you think fiction has this power to not just maybe offer an optimistic view, but a view that's much more nuanced? And I think both of you talked about, Denise, you talked about in putting this collection together, you saw how many different perspectives there are in this one area, carbon removal or carbon repair, right? I love that phrase. But yeah, if you could talk about that and how we have a tendency in the way we talk about climate change, it's like dystopic or utopian, but that there's reality that we haven't yet imagined is something far more nuanced, and how maybe both of you are reaching for that.
And it's funny you should ask that, because yesterday I was doing a session with people presenting projects about climate resilience, and they wanted to know how to make them more engaging. And they were kind of reading for a bird's eye view of a project they were doing. And one of the things that I was saying is, if you give these different perspective characters, who's the protagonist? Why does it matter to them? Give them flesh and blood so we can relate to them. Because I've done quite a lot of research in how people respond to stories. And having characters they can relate to, engaging in activities they feel they can also do, is the most sort of inspiring. If there's points of recognition between your life and that character, and it can, personalizes it. It makes you much more able to envision what something might be like, for better or worse. So the other day I read a young adult book called The Carbon Diaries, which imagines a world with a carbon ration where everyone's got carbon credits. And it is a bit dystopian, but it's also about a girl just looking for love and trying to, it's a coming of age story first and foremost, but that's the backdrop. And so you get a sense of what it might be like to be living in that kind of society. And another thing I learned from my research was, funnily enough, people are quite, I think, desensitized to hearing about people suffering from climate. And I had a story where an old lady and her caged bird died in a flood. And no one cared about the old lady, but they were really upset by the bird. So there's something about this poor bird trapped in a cage that really got them in the gut. So it doesn't always have to be, human characters. But for some reason that touched an emotional chord. And I think it just it personalizes it.
Yeah, a phrase I like for one of how fiction functions in this realm is I think I first heard it from Joni Adamson, called a seeing instrument, right? And there are just lots of different forms the seeing instrument can take. It can be a telescope, it can be a microscope, be a sort of magnifying glass, and it's a tool for going in and using a particular set of human intellectual instincts to examine a problem, a scenario, a possibility. And hopefully, for some people, it's a more compelling way to consume and engage with those issues. I think stories can be really effective and evocative for a lot of people. I don't think they work for everyone, because clearly some people grow up and don't read any fiction and love to read scientific papers or whatever, right? But I think we need a whole tidal wave of culture making around this topic as part of a broader societal mobilization, where we all, every aspect of our society gets involved in addressing these problems and getting on board with the energy transition and climate adaptation and all these different pieces. And so, stories aren't themselves, I think, going to save the planet, right? And you occasionally see, but I think that they are a necessary, if not sufficient, part, right? I don't think we can get there without this kind of culture making and a whole bunch of culture making that is just part of this mobilization we need. So I think the studies of how climate fiction affects people's attitudes are really interesting, right? It doesn't tend to convince people, but it tends to sort of raise the fidelity of people's concern about the climate. It brings it not necessarily to sort of a broad audience, but to a different audience. So yeah, I kind of just consider myself sort of a role player in this, but I think the big advantage is this kind of seeing instrument effect of being able to go in and examine a problem with the basically 500-year-old tool of the novel or the short story that many of us have sort of many generations of work sort of honing into a very effective instrument for making sense of human life. So
thank you. Well, I feel like you're talking about seeing instruments, and I feel like you've written one, this short story. So would you give us a reading, and maybe do you want to frame
Sure
a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So this story is set in a future in which we've sort of accomplished, at least in America, a switch to solar and wind and renewable energy, and are now have a bunch of very complicated incentives around a kind of retail carbon removal regime where people can buy small scale DAC rigs and hook them up to the solar panels on their houses. And when it's sort of financially, when the incentives align just right, when the sun is high and they're producing more electrons than they need, and the grid doesn't want them that much, they can use them to run their DAC rigs and pull carbon dioxide out of the air. And this young kid who's working as a sort of valet, Raf, he finds out about this kind of thing through someone who's got a DAC rig sort of in their car. And he's like, wait a second, you can get paid for pulling, you can basically pull money out of the air. I want to get in on this. And he figures out that there's sort of room in this starting to knit together arrangement for someone to kind of do the transportation aspect, to go around to sort of suburban neighborhoods where people have installed these sort of retail DAC rigs, and picking up their CO2 and transferring it to places where it can be disposed of and get a credit for. So he starts to offer his services and has starting to build out a a bit of a business doing this. So this section begins after he's kind of gotten his hand on that project and is starting to sort of come up against new challenges. Thing is, Wash said the third time Raph showed up to empty his tank at the greenhouse, we're only allowed to take so many tons a month. The CO2 we pump will end up back in the air, see, so we're neutrals, not proper negatives. I've been letting you jump the line because of that brunch beamer situation you hooked up, but we're almost full up. Next time, you'll have to wait your turn like everyone else. So what do I do? Raph said. I've got clients, man. If I don't show when they need me, they're not going to text again. You'll just have to start hauling to some other disposal sites. There are other greenhouses, but your best bet is to probably find folks angling for 500-year certificates. Okay, what are they like? Wash scratched his sun-peeled nose. As far as I can tell, either really boring or really weird. Raph soon agreed with Wash's assessment. After dropping a few hours learning to navigate inscrutable and clunky government databases, he found a registry of carbon disposal sites sortable by zip code. Some were listed like BLM Tract 94.11 Test Reservoir B, while others had punny startup names like Firm with a Y, Climb Safe, Carbon in the Oven, the Store Age, a forever management company, or more ominously, Black Paper. The names didn't exactly inspire confidence that he could bring his tank in and get a nice, clean, federally monitored transaction he was used to with Wash. Raph had visions of rolling up to discover the address was just some scammer's P.O. box, or else locked behind some huge turret-guarded fence. That was the hazard of being a small retail player trying to interface with a big B2B scene. So he started calling around, seeing who was actually willing to take his client's gas. This turned out to be an education beyond the viral video crash course. Removing CO2 from the atmosphere was plenty complicated, but what to do with it once captured was in some ways the trickier part of the puzzle. Once upon a time, all that sea had been neatly buried underground in the form of hydrocarbons like oil and coal, put there by biogeologic processes that unfolded over eons. Digging up all that energy-rich goop had been a chaotic, often brutal, multi-century project. Now the world was trying to get the byproduct of hydrocarbon combustion, CO2, out of the air even faster than it had emitted it. But where to put it? The coal barons and oil megacorps hadn't exactly been fastidious about leaving clean, secure reservoirs behind as they carved up the earth. Plus, CO2 is just a more annoying substance to deal with. Not combustible, thankfully, but still poisonous, and usually an invisible gas. It was a molecule sitting at near enough its lowest energetic state, so turning CO2 into anything useful took inputs of power. Plants did this, using sunlight to drive photosynthesis to turn atmospheric carbon into stems, leaves, trunks, and roots. Growing trees was a decent carbon storage option, but forests tended to either be competing for space in verdant areas or water in deserts like Nevada, and plants left to their own devices also died and decomposed, eventually releasing most of that carbon back into the air. Thus everyone in the climate repair business was trying to figure out how to either pump captured CO2 underground and make it stay there, or else bite the energy bullet and turn it into durable, sellable products. So, in for better or worse American fashion, the landscape was littered with companies and nonprofits taking tentative amounts of carbon dioxide and somewhat less tentative amounts of federal money and experimenting with different ways of getting rid of it. The BLM sites were mostly pumping it into former fracking wells. Firm and Climb Safe had proprietary storage techniques that involved burying treated lumber and speeding up rock mineralization, respectively. Carbon in the Oven was actually a weird artist commune that made CO2 impregnated ceramics. The person at the Store Age who answered Raph's cold call was confused as to why they were still in the Federal Registry. They had pivoted to consulting, advising on how to set up institutional board structures that could maintain their stability over climate-relevant timeframes. Black Paper sold books. fireproof, rot-proof books they claimed would hold their carbon for at least 1,000 years. And so on, with some pitches sounding to Raff promising and others dubious, but each in their own way an exciting example of just how many ideas people had about repairing the climate. Raff had spent the entirety of his young life generally aware that he had been born into an environmentally worse off planet than his parents' grandparents had inherited. There was something rebellious, countercultural, even gleefully fuck you about deciding that he was going to buck that multi-generational trend, that he was going to help clean up the mess and fix it.
Thank you so much. That's the perfect place to end that section. So I wanted to ask you a question about this story specifically. There's and something that Denise said about giving flesh and blood to a scenario, and you do that through Raff. This is the middle of the story, or somewhere in the middle of the story, but there's a lot of his voice really comes through, and the language he learns about the carbon removal kind of industry and this niche that he finds himself like creating for, that he creates for himself, and that he then kind of takes on the language of that world becomes part of his language, and it becomes part of his voice. So when you just in your process of writing it, how did you, like, what was the seed? Like, was there an image? I know for me as a writer, sometimes it's like I hear a character and then, okay, I'm going to go, or I see a scene. I'm like, okay, now and I don't know what's going to come next. And it's that not knowing what's going to come next that is kind of critical to my process. If I know what's going to come next, then like the energy is gone. It's too predictable. It's dead to me, even though it's easier to write and less painful. But I was wondering for you, like, what was your seed? And did it change, I guess, the writing of the story? Did it change from what you thought it was going to be? I feel like often that happens.
Yeah, no, I'm the same way. I mean, I'm always trying to, I feel like somewhere on the kind of platonic plane is the sort of ideal version of the story that already exists, and I'm trying to sort of write the next sentence of that story. And I often don't know what it's going to be, and the process of making the next sentence more interesting than the previous one is sort of a driving force to my craft. The seed for this was I guess kind of this image of someone driving around with a DAC rig on their car and bring it to a valet. And I call him a sun valet, where he's not just parking people's cars, he's trying to park them in sunbeams because the cars themselves have solar panels on the roof and want to recharge. So, the idea of someone who's this working class kid who is kind of around a bunch of high tech stuff all the time, but doesn't quite have an inroad yet to, I guess, like he's not an engineer, but he kind of, and he's never had the opportunity to like go to college and figure out what he's good at. But he encounters a kind of this world that is new and that he didn't know was there, and that has ideas that just kind of click with him, and decides to sort of run with it and try and make an extra buck. And from that, just sort of is drawn kind of deeper and deeper via the sort of entrepreneurial sort of momentum that I think some people develop. And the story also has a lot about his relationship with his grandmother, who was a really fun character to write, because she's sort of at this point like an aged millennial, who has all kinds of, personality tics that are kind of unique to my generation of having almost this sort of hustle bro kind of mindset, the grind set, if you will, about trying to sort of maximize one's sort of passive income streams and all these things. And that was fun to just sort of get to send up a little bit of the familiar and kind of present discourse around that type of entrepreneurial activity, and be like, okay, but imagine if you were still talking about this when you're in your 60s and 70s, right? You're like, you would sound ridiculous, but also there would still be sort of a kernel of something there, at least something that a 19, 20-year-old kid can latch on to. So yeah, and I think, I'm a big believer in stories about people excited by ideas, and because I get excited by ideas. And what I read a novel recently where it was a little more of a literary novel, and the protagonist was a writer, and it was on a book tour, and it was just seemed like deeply bored by her own book and the subject matter. And that for me just doesn't strike home, right? Like I think it's way more interesting and fun and true to life for people to be, at their kind of like most interesting as characters when they're excited about stuff that they're figuring out about the world. And this was a part of Raph figuring out how the world works. So yeah, I guess that's, but like you said, a lot of that was just instinctual, and trying to make Raph and the world interesting in concert. And so it's a little bit of a only going back can I kind of then read and be like, oh yeah, there was like sort of arc there that he had.
I'm curious, Denise, is that true in your process? Because you're coming at fiction from, well, I guess from a similar place, thinking about communication, right? But in the process of writing, and you've written different kinds of things, screenplays and scripts, and now short stories, and then the novel. And so, yeah, did they end up going places that you are surprised by, even when there's this, I don't want to say it's a message necessarily, but are you surprised sometimes by what your characters end up engaging with in terms of, a climate solution or the technology that they're dealing with? Is it, yeah. So if you could just talk about that.
I guess for me, it's the characters in my head are always, they're really rich to me. So when I first start out, I know what I want to write, and the characters are kind of ciphers. But as I get into it, the characters become absolutely real to me. And this is when anyone who's in my vicinity needs to beware, because they're all just source material. And what is hilarious is no one ever knows who they are. When it's absolutely obvious to me, you are that character. When are you going to notice and tell me off? They always think there was someone completely different, or never read it at all. So as the characters flesh out, they have their own. It becomes a restriction, really. There are things they wouldn't do, and there's things they would do, and who they are and what they want drives the story. So I might have an idea or a concept to hang it on, but where it then goes depends, changes as the characters get fleshed out.
I think what's interesting, and I see it happening in the story, Andrew, and what you're describing, Denise, is that there, especially where you left off, Andrew, where he has this idea of like, well, maybe he's not just a cog, right? Like maybe he can have some agency. And that arc to his character that I'm a firm believer you can't necessarily plan that, but that it makes this, carbon removal figures in the story, but if it actually has a role in his development as a character, which I thought was really interesting, that it's not just here's the backdrop of the world that we live in and he's living in it, but it's like this is interacting with how he thinks of himself. I think this hope where he's like, well, maybe I could play some role in fixing this. Like I could have, as opposed to feeling completely helpless. And so how you hold both the dystopic reality of what, it's still a grind. There's still a lot of inequality. There's still all of that is still there. But then perhaps in the way this technology is distributed, it offers him this opportunity. So yeah, I really loved, I feel like there's all sorts of terms that came out of this conversation that maybe people haven't heard about. Like I hadn't heard about green hush, and I love climate repair. I think social science fiction. Yes.
Yeah, I just made that up now.
we should have a list. One thing, do you find that kind of all fiction going forward is climate fiction in some ways? Like it's going to become, I've heard that talked about, how it's almost like if you set a story in the early 2020s, you can't pretend there's not a pandemic, right? Like
I think that's a really good point. And especially with TV, which I don't write for TV, but I consume TV. And Reena, you're right that in theory we shouldn't be able to write about the 2020s without writing about the pandemic. But if you go and turn on television shows, nobody in those shows is experiencing the pandemic hardly at all, right? They're all living in an alternate version of the present. And, I think I don't know if the same thing might happen with climate change. I think the sort of impacts on the societal reckoning with it is sort of different. But certainly you're right that that's been a discussion within science fiction, that all science fiction is climate fiction now. And I remember one time being introduced as sort of a climate fiction person to a successful science fiction writer. And she said, like, oh, I thought we weren't doing that term. And, and that's sort of genre drama and kind of like shocking for the shelf and this kind of thing. But, the truth is that lots of science fiction does get written that is set thousands of years in the future in the galactic space empires or on another planet, and is not, in fact, particularly interested in the bottleneck that we face, right? That we have to get through this particular crisis if we want to have a shot for any of those grand science fictional dreams of exploring the cosmos, if any of those are plausible at all. So I think, if you're gonna write about the future, you got to write about the climate. But that's still, it's still kind of a debate being had and like sort of a struggle playing out. And I think, it's a critique one can level and be like, okay, your sort of space opera in the far future might not need to talk about how we made it through this particular set of crises in the 21st century. But if you don't, that makes it more of a fantasy than a science fiction future. So that is, I think, a tricky topic because, so much of sci-fi is riffing on the tropes that people have created, and kind of this, I call sort of a Jenga conversation where people sort of like pluck out an idea and they put it on top in a different way and be like, oh, what if it looked like this? And slowly but surely climate is filtering into the Jenga stack really thoroughly, but there's still lots of just like, what if a robot, like how and that happens, that can be perfectly interesting and fun, but maybe isn't that sort of relevant to our sort of current thinking. And so there's always a balance in speculative fiction between the escapist and the sort of realist, or and it's, I write both. So I hope that we can find room in our hearts for both, but continue this conversation about climate fiction as a useful tool.
Yeah, and it's so cool to have a chance to talk to both of you who are a big part of that. So I just want to thank you both for spending this time. I feel like I learned a bunch of things. I'm excited about a bunch of things about writing also. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, our pleasure.